The scent of charred cedar and burnt lavender hung heavy over the valley, a sickly perfume that choked the morning air. Where the Miller farm once stood, only blackened ribs of timber clawed at the New Mexico sky. The heat still rose in shimmering waves from the foundation, a ghost of the fire that had consumed everything. Sheriff Miller didn't look at the ruin. He looked at his boots, polished and pitiless against the grey ash. Billy stood on the ridge, his eyes stinging from the drifting soot. He felt the rough grain of his Winchester's stock against his thumb, a familiar comfort in a world gone jagged. The sun was a brass coin tossed into a dusty sky, offering heat but no warmth. He remembered the smell of fresh bread from that kitchen just a week ago. He remembered Sarah Miller's hands, red and chapped from work, but gentle when she handed him a canteen. "They didn't have to do it, kid," whispered Chavez, standing beside him. Billy didn't answer. He watched the sheriff's men ride away, their laughter carried thin and tinny by the wind. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. It was a silence that tasted of copper and old regrets. He looked at the scorched earth where a small garden had been struggling to bloom. Sarah couldn't have known that giving a thirsty man a cup of water would cost her the roof over her head. The sheriff called it harboring a fugitive, but Billy knew it was just a message written in fire. The boundary between law and cruelty had blurred until it disappeared entirely. "We're heading deep into the Jornada del Muerto," Billy finally said, his voice a low rasp. "Let 'em think the desert swallowed us whole." He reached into his vest and pulled out a small tarnished brass key Sarah had given him for the root cellar, the only thing that hadn't burned. It felt cold, a weight of autonomy in a palm mapped by scars. He gripped it tight. "Only if you want it to be," she had told him when he asked if the West was truly as wild as they said. Now the words felt like a curse. They turned their horses toward the shimmering horizon, where the sand met the sky in a haze of heat. The desert was a furnace, a place where secrets went to die and men became legends or dust. Billy didn't look back at the smoke. He looked forward into the blinding white light of the wasteland, waiting for the fire in his blood to match the sun. The Jornada del Muerto was a land of beautiful cruelty. The air was so dry it cracked the skin on Billy's lips, tasting of salt and ancient stone. Every mile was a test of bone and spirit. The horses' hooves made a rhythmic thud crunch on the baked clay, the only sound for hours except for the occasional whistle of a hawk overhead. On the third day, the water ran low. The heat was a physical weight, a shimmering curtain that distorted the mesas into floating fortresses. Billy felt the grit of sand between his teeth and the coarse friction of his wool vest against his sun-scorched neck. He noticed the way the wind shifted, carrying the faint metallic tang of water and the musk of unwashed buckskin. The horizon wasn't a line anymore. It was a jagged, pulsing wound where the sky bled white heat onto the cracked earth beneath his horse's hooves. Every breath Billy took felt like swallowing hot ash, his throat closing up until it was little more than a dry, constricted canyon of its own, while the relentless glare of the sun turned the brass casings in his belt into stinging points of fire against his hips. His mount, a sturdy buckskin with foam drying like sea salt at its bits, stumbled once, a rhythmic reminder that the desert didn't care about bounties, burnt farms, or vengeance. It only cared about what it could eventually claim for the vultures circling in the indigo heights. He tightened his grip on the reins, the leather slick with a mixture of his own sweat and the fine red silt that seemed to permeate his very soul, forcing his mind to ignore the phantom sound of a running stream that played cruel tricks on his parched imagination. The shift in the atmosphere was subtle, a whisper of change that rippled through the stagnant, blistering air like a stone dropped into a still pond. That metallic scent wasn't just a hallucination of water. It was the smell of ancient survival, a mixture of damp, hidden stone and the deep, earthy musk of men who lived as part of the scrub and the rimrock. Billy slowed his pace to a measured walk. his eyes narrowing as he scanned the ridges where the heat haze danced most violently, instinctively knowing that those floating fortresses were no longer empty monuments of stone. Shadows began to detach themselves from the burnt orange cliffs, silhouettes that moved with a predatory, silent grace that made his heart hammer a steady, hollow beat against his ribs. Yet he pointedly kept his hands away from his Winchester, choosing instead to let the heavy silence speak for his peaceful intentions. When the lead warrior finally crested the dune, his presence was as sudden and absolute as a thunderclap in a cloudless sky, standing as a sentinel of the high desert. The sun glinted off the polished bone of his breastplate, and for a long, agonizing moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, caught in the razor-thin tension between a sudden bullet and an offered hand. Billy felt a strange, chilling respect settle over him, a realization that he was a mere trespasser in a cathedral of sand and spirits where his notoriety meant nothing and his character meant everything. He watched as the chief descended the slope, the sand hissing beneath the hooves of his painted pony like 1,000 snakes. And in that charged encounter, the frontier felt less like a lawless border and more like a sacred bridge between the outlaw he was forced to be and the human man he was trying to remember. A line of silhouettes appeared on the ridge, perfectly still against the setting sun. They were Apache, shadows woven from the desert itself. Billy raised his hand, palm open, the universal sign of a man with nothing to hide and everything to lose. The lead warrior, an older man with skin like weathered oak, rode down the slope. His eyes were dark pools of ancient knowledge. "You seek the shade of the Great Spirit, little brother?" the chief asked, in a voice that sounded like grinding stones. The interaction was not one of conquest, but of survival. Billy shared his tobacco, the dry leaves smelling of earth and honey. In return, they sat by a small hidden spring where the water was sweet and cold, a miracle in the middle of a furnace. The chief spoke of the land, not as property to be fenced, but as a living thing that breathed through the canyons. They watched. The warriors watched Billy as he tended to a lame horse with a tenderness that defied his reputation. He didn't use the whip. He used a low hum and a steady hand. The chief nodded slowly, seeing the softer side that the lawman in Lincoln County chose to ignore. The stallion's flank heaved, a rhythmic expansion of coarse, sun-baked hide that pulsed against Billy's calloused palms as he worked with a focus that bordered on the sacred. He knelt in the ochre dust, ignoring the sharp bite of gravel against his knees, his movements narrowed down to the swollen joint and the heat radiating from the injured limb. There was no anger in his touch, only a deliberate grounding patience as he pressed a cool poultice of chewed roots against the inflammation, his voice dropping into a low, melodic vibration that seemed to bypass the animal's fear and settle directly into its bones. To any observer in Lincoln, this was the hand that fanned a revolver's hammer with lethal speed. Yet here, under the watchful gaze of the desert, it was a vessel of quiet restoration, proving that the boy behind the legend still possessed a soul that recognized the sanctity of a life that asked for nothing but mercy. Standing like ancient statues carved from the canyon walls, the warriors remained motionless. Their presence felt more through the weight of their collective silence than the sound of their breathing. The chief observed the way the fading light caught the boy's eyes, not the frenzied glint of a cornered wolf, but a soft, reflective clarity that mirrored the hidden deep-well springs of the high desert. He recognized a man who existed precariously between two worlds, one of iron and blood dictated by the white man's greed, and another of earth and spirit, where names were earned through character rather than printed on a wanted poster. As the wind whistled through the saguaro, carrying the sharp scent of impending rain and distant sage, the chief understood that Billy's violence was a protective shell, a jagged suit of armor worn to shield a heart that still remembered the warmth of a hearth and the simple dignity of a home that now lay in ashes. When the task was finally done and the horse stood steady on all four hooves, a profound stillness settled over the camp, a heavy peace that felt both like a blessing and a heavy burden. Billy stood slowly, wiping the grime and green sap onto his worn trousers, his gaze drifting toward the darkening horizon where the silhouette of the mountains looked like the jagged, broken teeth of a forgotten god. He knew that this sanctuary was a fleeting ghost, a momentary pause before he had to descend back into the Valley of Shadows to confront the sheriff and the ghosts of the Miller farm. The contrast between the tender healer he had just been and the cold-eyed avenger he was forced to become tasted like copper in his mouth, a reminder that in the lawless West, survival often required killing the very parts of yourself that were most worth saving. He reached for his gun belt, the leather creaking in the twilight, and the transition was complete. The boy was gone, and the kid was once again ready to meet a destiny written in lead. "The law of the white man is like the tumbleweed," the chief said, looking at the fire. "It has no roots. It only goes where the wind blows. Your heart has roots, young one. But roots in a fire will only turn to coal." Billy looked at the horizon, where the stars were beginning to pierce the purple velvet of the night. He thought of the sheriff's badge, a star made of cold tin. He thought of the Miller farm. The peace here was a fragile thing, a temporary border between his past and his purpose. He knew he couldn't stay in the sanctuary of the red earth forever. The return to the outskirts of Lincoln was a descent into a different kind of heat. The air in the valley was thick with the smell of horse manure, cheap whiskey, and the metallic ozone of an approaching storm. Billy sat in the shadows of an abandoned stable, the rough hay pricking through his shirt. He cleaned his Colt 45 with a piece of oiled rag, the rhythmic click-slide of the cylinder a prayer of preparation. The town was a hive of nervous energy. The sheriff had doubled the guards, his fear manifesting as a tightening noose around the necks of the townspeople. Billy watched from the loft as a young girl struggled with a heavy bucket of water near the well. Without a word, he descended, masked by the dusk, and took the weight from her. The young girl stared at his hands, not the fingers that danced with lightning speed across a trigger guard, but the steady, calloused palms that now bore the crushing weight of her burden. The water sloshed against the wooden staves of the bucket, a rhythmic, cool sound that felt like a sin in a town choked by the dry heat of corruption. Billy didn't offer a smile, for a smile would be a target in the dim twilight of Lincoln, but the way he adjusted his Stetson to shield her from the prying eyes of the deputies on the boardwalk spoke volumes of a code the lawmen had long since buried in the dust. As he set the heavy pail down by her doorstep, the scent of lavender from her small, wilted garden patch drifted up, mixing with the harsh tang of manure and gun oil, a fleeting reminder of the farm that had been turned to ash. He noticed the way her small fingers trembled as she reached for the handle, and for a moment the cold blue steel of his purpose softened into a quiet, protective resolve that the history books would never bother to record. Across the street, the sheriff's office stood like a fortress of unwashed conscience, the yellow lamplight spilling out onto the dirt in jagged, sickly stripes. The sound of heavy spurs dragging against the weathered pine of the boardwalk echoed through the silence, a predatory cadence that signaled the closing of the trap Pat Garrett had set for the boy outlaw. Billy retreated back into the velvet shadows of the alleyway, his movements as fluid and silent as a mountain lion's, his senses heightened to the point where he could almost taste the iron in the air and feel the nervous sweat of the guards stationed at the corner. The town had become a cage of its own making, a place where the boundary between a protector and a tyrant had been burned away just like the miller's livestock, leaving only the scorched remains of a community that was too terrified to breathe. He felt the rough texture of the tobacco pouch in his pocket, a gift from the Apache chief, and it served as a grounding weight, a piece of the wild, honest desert carried into this den of manufactured law. As the first heavy droplets of the storm began to crater the thick dust of the main street, the atmosphere reached a breaking point, a tension so thick it felt like a physical pressure against the chest. Billy leaned back against the damp stone of a warehouse wall, the cold bite of the rising wind cutting through his thin vest and carrying the distant lonely howl of a coyote from the mesas. This was the frontier he had chosen, a place where justice was a jagged, uncomfortable thing that didn't always wear a badge, and where a man's worth was measured by the kindness he showed when no one was looking and the violence he unleashed when he finally was pushed too far. He checked the hammer of his Colt one last time, the metallic click swallowed by a low roll of thunder that rumbled like a warning from the very earth he intended to reclaim. The time for hiding in the rafters and passing wooden birds to children was ending. The fire that had consumed the wrong farm was about to be reflected in the eyes of the man who had returned from the dead to settle the score. "Thank you, mister," she whispered, her eyes wide. He handed her a small carved wooden bird he'd made during the long nights in the desert. A small act of kindness in a place that forgot how to smile. He noticed the bruise on her arm where a deputy had pushed her aside earlier. The fire in his chest, once a wild blaze, had distilled into a cold blue flame of resolve. "Go home, little one," Billy said softly. "Stay inside tomorrow." The atmosphere in the local saloon, the Silver Spur, was a powder keg. The floorboards groaned under heavy boots, and the air was a thick fog of cigar smoke and desperation. The sheriff sat in the corner, his Stetson pulled low, his fingers drumming a restless beat on the scarred mahogany table. He was a man who owned the law, but possessed no justice. The boundary was set. The fence that the sheriff had built around the wrong farm wasn't just made of barbed wire, it was made of greed. Billy stood at the edge of the town square as the moon rose, a silver blade cutting through the clouds. He felt the cold bite of the night air, a sharp contrast to the simmering rage in his gut. "It's time," Chavez whispered from the darkness of an alleyway. Billy adjusted his neckerchief, the fabric coarse against his throat. He wasn't just an outlaw anymore. He was a reckoning. The bad guy was coming back to collect a debt that couldn't be paid in gold. He stepped into the moonlight, his spurs jingling a soft, lethal melody against the frozen ground. The storm had finally arrived. The dawn broke grey and heavy, the sun a pale ghost behind a shroud of dust. The main street of Lincoln was a canyon of silence. The only sound was the rhythmic creak slap of a loose shutter and the distant moan of the wind. Billy stood at one end of the street, his silhouette tall and lean, a shadow cast by the history books of the future. The sheriff stepped out of his office, his badge catching the weak morning light. He looked at Billy, and for a moment the bravado vanished. He saw not a killer, but a mirror of his own failures. Behind the sheriff, his deputies fanned out, their hands hovering over their holsters like nervous birds. The silence between them stretched like a worn rawhide lariat, taut and vibrating with the threat of snapping at any moment. Billy felt the grit of the Lincoln street beneath his boots, the fine powder of the New Mexico earth seemingly mourning the peace that was about to be shattered. The air carried the faint metallic tang of gun oil and the stale, sour scent of the sheriff's overnight whiskey, a sharp contrast to the memory of the sweet lavender and clean mountain air that had once graced the Miller Ranch. He noticed the way the sheriff's hand trembled, just a fraction of an inch above the ivory grip of his holstered sidearm, a telltale sign of a man who realized his authority was merely a thin veneer of tin pinned to a heart, hollowed out by greed. The sun, though obscured, began to bake the wood of the surrounding buildings, releasing the dry, thirsty smell of aged cedar that seemed to crave the coming rain of lead. Behind the jagged glass of the darkened storefronts, the townspeople held their collective breath, their faces mere pale blurs in the shadows as they watched the legend and the lawman prepare for the inevitable. The wind kicked up a sudden, violent swirl of dust that danced between the two men, a physical manifestation of the chaos that had reigned since the sheriff's torches turned a family's hope into a blackened scar on the valley floor. Billy's fingers, calloused by the hard reality of a life on the run, but still capable of the gentlest touch, hovered with a predator's stillness. He wasn't thinking of the posters or the headlines, but of the cold, unyielding weight of the root cellar key in his pocket. The boundary between a hero and a villain had never felt so thin. A line drawn in the dirt of a town that had traded its conscience for the comfort of a corrupt man's shadow, and the tension was a physical pressure against the eardrums, louder than any roar. She couldn't have known that her act of simple charity would lead to this final, desperate crossroads, but the weight of her loss sat heavy on Billy's shoulders, more burdensome than the iron he carried. The sheriff took a tentative step forward, his spurs giving a sharp, lonely jingle that echoed off the livery stable walls, a sound that signaled the end of diplomacy and the beginning of the old code. Every sensory detail, the coarse texture of Billy's wool vest, the sudden sharp cry of a distant crow, and the way the morning light refused to glint off the sheriff's tarnished soul, pointed toward a conclusion that the history books would surely sanitize. This was the raw, unwashed reality of the frontier, where justice wasn't found in a courtroom, but in the steady gaze of a young man who had seen the worst of humanity and decided in the quiet of a desert night that some fires could only be extinguished by a different kind of flame. "You should have stayed in the desert, kid," the sheriff yelled, his voice cracking. "You burned the wrong farm, Pat." Billy's voice was a calm tide. "You burned a woman's life because you were too cowardly to face me." The duel was not a flash of cinematic glory, but a sudden, violent eruption. The smell of black powder filled the air, acrid and stinging. Billy moved with a fluid, terrifying grace. "Only if you want it to be," he whispered to the ghost of Sarah Miller as his Winchester spoke. The sheriff's men fell back, overwhelmed not by numbers, but by the sheer, focused intensity of a man who had nothing left to lose. When the smoke cleared, the sheriff lay in the dirt, his polished boots now covered in the same grey ash that had buried the Miller farm. Billy didn't pull the trigger a final time. He stood over him, the barrel of his gun still warm, the scent of lavender, perhaps a trick of the mind, wafting on the breeze. He reached down and tossed the tarnished brass key onto the sheriff's chest. "Rebuild it," Billy said, his voice hard as flint. "Every timber, every fence post, or I'll come back from the desert again." They watched. The townspeople emerged from their homes, watching the notorious killer walk toward his horse. He didn't take the money from the bank. He didn't burn the town. He simply mounted his horse and looked toward the western horizon, where the Apache lands lay. The final reflection was one of a complex justice. The land didn't belong to the law, and it didn't belong to the outlaws. It belonged to those who bled for it, and those who tended it with kindness. Billy rode away into the shimmering haze, a figure of myth and mystery. As he reached the edge of town, he looked at a small flower pushing through the cracked earth near a fence. "Only if you want it to be," he muttered, a faint smile touching his lips, before he vanished into the golden dust of the frontier.